Good afternoon again. As Brad just said, you are going to be the first group in the United States of America to see this new construct. Myself, my wife, and Sarah have been a part of this, as well as some other great people that have helped me over the years. And I just want to highlight that because this is new, I may leave you with more questions than I do answers. And so I want you to not feel bad. Also, those that I talk to and ask for prayer, I pray that you're praying for me right now because I just did a session and I'm a little tired. Those that were here know I put in a full-time job up here for this group. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm looking forward to seeing the video sometime soon. Aspirational justice, a new paradigm for healing and radical justice in a fragmented world. When Brad approached me with being the keynote speaker for this great conference that we've been doing, I was touched and I was moved to be asked to do that. I had done some workshops for the previous conference. And so when he asked me to come and to do this, and then he told me that Tom Dart was going to be here to kind of bookend the session. He was going to start it and I was going to finish it. I was even equally moved, touched and moved. So I want to thank the committee. I want to thank Brad and the committee that put this together, and Ms. Rice and others that made sure. Come on, give them a hand, the committee that put this together, this great conference together. Our nation was built on aspiration. There are individuals that felt that the way in which government was being operated for centuries was wrong. And they said they had a better way, that the ruler wouldn't be the monarchy, but that there would be a contract between the people and those that would represent the people. This man is an aspirational framer of the Declaration of Independence. This man's name is Thomas Jefferson. And he was tasked with writing these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This started a war called the Revolutionary War, which culminated in this aspirational thought being written and penned to King George III to actually be realized that we truly can create a nation built on this social contract. And so in 1787, these men came together in Philadelphia and decided to aspire to a way of government that would be different from anything that they ever saw in their lives. And a gentleman by the name of Gouverneur Morris was tasked with writing the preamble to the Constitution. And when they gave him the rough copy, it said, "We the states," and it named all the 13 states. But Gouverneur Morris realized that we're not just made up of these 13 states, but that there are people that live in these 13 states, and so he decided to pen these words. "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessing of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And so in looking at these men who created this aspirational view of government that we are now living in right now, 200 and odd years later, that's something to be proud of, isn't it? That's something to look at yourself, right? Come on, clap. That's something to be proud of. That they took off the shackles of the monarchy and put the power into the hands of the people. That's a beautiful thing to think about. But there's a problem. And we have to address this problem. You see, what occurred and what happened was that they needed to make sure that they were able to pay for the army to protect themselves from the British if they decided to come back. They had to pay for government and taxation. They had to pay for the economy. They had to pay for all of these things. And what was decided upon, they had an opportunity to not carry over the vestiges of slavery from the British, or that inheritance of slavery from the British. They had an opportunity to stop it right there in 1787, and they decided not only to not stop it, but to escalate it, which created the transatlantic slave trade, which was not just America involved, but it was the world involved. It was even the tribes in Africa that were involved in this trade of human beings. Cotton bolstered the American economy and made America a world power. But it was on the backs of Africans who were enslaved. Condoleezza Rice, in a speech, she stated that America's birth defect is slavery and racism. And so this is something that I want us to see if we can contend with today as we talk about this new construct. I want to share with you a definition that will help us to understand why the African American has not been able to be integrated into American society in the way that they should have been. The Ma'afa, as people call it, it's called the Middle Passage, but it's not only the Middle Passage from Africa to the Caribbean and then to the Americas, but it's also, as Mariba Ani states, a great disaster and misfortune, death and destruction beyond human comprehension and convention. The Ma'afa requires the denial of the validity of the humanity of the African. You see, the African was diminished from being a human being to being a thing that would be used, a commodity that would be used in order to meet the ends and the means that America needed in terms of running its economy. De Tocqueville looked at the entrepreneurial spirit of America and looked at all these great things when he did a scan of what was going on in America, but there was also this stain of the Ma'afa, this stain of slavery that was still there and being used to better American society. But in 1861, in 1860, there was an election. And Abraham Lincoln was elected, the 16th president of the United States. And subsequent days after that, Fort Sumter fell, and the Civil War began, the most brutal and bloody war that America has ever seen since its existence. Most people who are students of the Civil War realize and understand that this was our second Revolutionary War. This was a time where America was testing whether it can withstand being half slave or half free. It was a time where America was looking at itself in the mirror and saying, is this the America that we want to be, not only for us, but for those that came in chains? And so over the course of this war, some incredible people showed up that were great heroes. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, the Civil War African-American military man represented down there, and of course, Abraham Lincoln and those of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, and the many other regiments, the Union Army, that fought and bled and died for a new America. Abraham Lincoln, in November of 1863, was called to give a speech at a little plot of land in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. There was another gentleman that spoke for 2 hours. He was the headliner. But Abraham Lincoln, as the President of the United States, was called to speak about what happened in July 1st through the 3rd on this plot of land, one of the most bloodiest of the battles, but one of the most incredible of battles, with great heroes and great men did some incredible things fighting for a new birth of freedom. And Abraham Lincoln was looking at an aspirational reunification of the Union, with African Americans being brought into the Union as citizens. And he penned these words, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The first African-American man to receive a PhD, however, wrote in his seminal book, Souls of Black Folk, that we still have a problem. That even though we had created Reconstruction, and even though we had put in place these systems and processes that would help to make the African-American truly become an African-American, there was still a problem. And he said the problem in America, and the problem that we have in the 21st century, my words, his words is 20th century, my words 21st century, is that of the color line. There's still a wall that demarcates who we are to you and who we are to each other and who we are as American citizens. And I believe that today can be the beginning of us tearing down that wall. I believe we have the power to tear it down. And I believe that all of us in this room have the ability to do that. You see, an old Baptist minister down in Atlanta, Georgia, realized that we could tear this down. And what he did is that he spoke eloquently in August of 1963, 100 years after the freedom of the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. He spoke on the monument in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, the dream that he had. I have that dream too. I want to see my 4 children judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this is 2018. I still have that dream. But in August 1963, he had a dream. And he shared these words, his aspirational vision for America 100 years after emancipation. With this faith, we'll be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let's freedom ring. And if America is going to be a great nation, this must become true. We've had some real important figures, both male and female, aspire to see America become a great nation. But 50 years after his death, African Americans are still wondering if we truly are a part of this great story of aspiration. And my answer to that is, yes, we are. As I was beginning this process of trying to figure out this construct, remember I told you this is my first time rolling it out to y'all, so please be patient with me, okay? Be patient with me, okay? It's my first time rolling out. You're going to have a lot more questions than answers, so just be patient with me, okay? I had these 3 questions that came to my mind. When I was doing restorative justice, I was doing peace circles, specifically with African Americans, I had this question in my mind. After we've done all the great work and we've restored them and everything is fine and we feel like their relationships are right, what are we truly restoring our children and families to when we look at their economic conditions, when we look at the social ills that are still going on, when we look at things that are still happening, but yet we might have peace in this situation, but we still have other things going on? Can restorative justice truly be the vehicle to help us solve those problems too? Is restorative justice just something that we do just in schools, just with police, just with different groups? But can it deal with the main issue of the birth defect of America? Can restorative justice help us to reach that perfect union that was penned in 1787? Howard Zare, a Morehouse man like me, great man, great theorist, great writer, great photographer, the godfather of restorative justice, helped me to kind of see what we can do with this aspirational justice piece, because I needed to understand what I was doing for about 15, 20 years in terms of restorative justice, how this can actually help deal with the ills that I'm seeing with my people, the African Americans. And so when you look at restorative justice, it looks at these three considerations: harm. When people in relationships are harmed, they create needs. Those needs create responsibility. So who's responsible to meet the needs of the harmed? And then engagement. Those impacted by wrongdoing should be a part of the restorative process. And so when you think about this flow chart, you look at these four aspects, these four areas, their focus is to get to a place where we can actually be in right relationship. But here's my question. Has the African American ever been in right relationship with America? Does restorative justice work for us when it comes to our needs, our harms, who's responsible, and how we can engage America in seeing itself as a great nation? I want to thank these brothers, because it was in this room in Oakland, California, a small organization called Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, headed by Fanya Davis, the sister of Dr. Angela Davis. And Fanya is also a doctor, a former lawyer, but she's also a restorative justice guru and someone that has changed the world, not only in her past work as a Black Panther, but also in her present work as a restorative justice practitioner and teacher. Well, she asked me to come to Oakland to do this circle, first of its kind, all-male circle. And I was there in the room with this professor, this African-American professor of psychology. And he changed my whole view of how this practice can be used to help heal the things that we've been going through as African Americans. His name is Dr. Wade Nobles, and he shared this incredible definition of power. He said power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. I'm going to say that again. Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. What he talked about, though, was the fact that the most important reality to define is our reality as human beings. And remember, I talked about earlier in my talk about the Ma'afa, right? The systematic breakdown of our humanity because of the need of a commodity or the need for economic wealth for a young nation. And he said, no matter what systems we have created, we must first take authority of our reality as human beings. So no matter what systems we create, if you don't see me as worth it because you don't see me as a human being, then that system won't meet my needs. So before we even have a conversation, you, me, all of us have to see each other as human. Then we can create the systems that will meet my needs, the programs that will meet my needs. Or you'll feel, or the nation will feel, that you're not deserving of it anymore, and we'll just repeal it. Instead of saying, you're a human being that deserves this, and you're a citizen of America, and you helped build this nation. So here's my working definition of aspirational justice, the italics part. This is kind of the first part is kind of the preamble. Aspirational justice is a truth and healing construct that seeks to engage historically disenfranchised groups, such as African Americans. Aspirational justice re-envisions and constructs a truth and healing process which reimagines a new racial and reparative relationship between all groups who have been historically harmed by slavery and its legacy. We always talk about legacy hurt African Americans, but it also hurt white people too. It also hurt others that were connected to it. It hurt everybody. Everybody was hurt by this terrible system. So if I know that to be true, that both the whites and the African Americans were hurt, harmed, whether psychologically, emotionally, physically, spiritually, then as a restorative justice practitioner, my job is to figure out how to heal that. Is that right? We can't think small about this. We have to think large about this and see ourselves as a vessel for healing in our nation. And if we say that we're restorative justice practitioners, we should be looking at where's the hurt and how can we heal that hurt. I believe that this construct has the recipe for it. These are the three areas that we want to touch on that are so important to this construct. The three areas that give it its legs are the symbolic, the institutional, and the tangible. How I view it is that all three of those legs work together to support each other. The symbolic construct supports the institutional construct, and the institutional construct supports the tangible, and the tangible supports the symbolic, and it just goes on and on. It's like a cycle, a perfect triangle. But what I wanted to understand and what I wanted to make certain of is that when we talk about symbols, so we're dealing with the symbols that make America, America, or make us as Americans connect to American culture. What are the symbolic processes needed to begin this new relationship toward healing and truth-telling? What new symbols need to be created to bolster this new journey toward healing? In terms of the institutional, the question that I had is, what are the institutional rearrangements and new institutions that need to be considered to sustain the process toward healing and reconciliation? And finally, when we look at the tangible, I wanted to know, what are the tangible reparative processes, the TRP, that need to be in place to begin the procedures toward equalizing the new economic reality aspirational justice will forge? What measurable outcomes will be attained that will bring about the true reparative process for those historically disenfranchised economically from American society, with a focus on eradicating poverty in America? This is big stuff, y'all. Let's go. I felt that in order for us to really be on a pathway toward aspirational justice, there has to be some truth-telling and some healing. South Africa is a model for truth and reconciliation through their process after the dismantling of apartheid and the creation of the new government in the 90s. And so we can look to them as a pathway or a way to do things, but of course we can change it to fit what America needs, because South Africa is a different country than the United States. But the symbolic, the institutional, and the tangible will still feed into this whole notion of truth-telling and creating that process where, as we move forward, everybody's on the same page as to what happened, who was harmed, and whose responsibility it is to repair that harm, and how we can engage the community. We all know that racism is the enemy. And racism has three legs itself. It has the institutional, the internal, and the interpersonal. Let's touch the internal, because that's going to connect with the symbolic area. Because it's not only how America sees us, it's how we see ourselves. And that we could internalize the negative images that have been put forth, and those negative images can make us feel less than who we are, hence acting in certain ways and doing certain things. So my argument is, why don't we change the images? Why don't we begin to change the symbols? Why don't we use other symbols that will begin to be life-affirming instead of continuing the conversation of the Ma'afa? We know interpersonally, between other groups, majority group and African Americans. And we know that there's structural racism, and we know there's institutional racism. And so when we look at the symbolic area, what we're looking at are these three areas. In terms of our truth-telling, we're looking at our suffering, the Ma'afa, and being clear that that is what we have continued to suffer even after emancipation, even after Reconstruction. Our triumphs, how we were able to triumph through with the help of whites, Latinos, blacks, others, through those difficult times. And then the third area of our symbolic area is our healing. How do we heal from 399 years? 2019 will be 400 years since the first Africans set foot in Jamestown in 1619. It won't happen overnight. This is a journey that we all have to take, and we all have to be courageous in showing our children how important this journey is. And so these are some questions that I want to consider if we talk about the symbolic. How are African Americans perceived in America? How do African Americans perceive themselves in America? And can the symbolic construct capture the imagination of American perceptions to reverse the pathology of America toward African Americans and African Americans' view of themselves? This was a high watershed moment for African Americans, and I believe for America, when we elected the 44th president of the United States. And he ushered in a new era of actually viewing how we as American citizens can truly become a more perfect union. I'm proud that I voted for him, and I'm proud to have lived in those 8 years. And I know that not only him as a president doing policy was important, but also the symbolic nature of actually seeing someone attain one of the high, if not, well, the highest office in the land, and him being African American, and him having an African American family and 2 beautiful daughters. I believe that that's a place right there to talk about the symbolic nature of how that can help us heal, not only as African Americans, but also as white Americans as well. In Joseph White's estimation as a psychologist, he said black children in the process of growing up needs things that are going to help them see themselves in a positive way, both realistically, reflected in books, movies, radio, TV, and the like. Another very prestigious historian stated that whoever controls the images controls your self-esteem, self-respect, and self-development. Dr. Leonard Jeffries. How many of you seen this movie? A comedian, D.L. Hughley, said that African Americans went for inspiration and whites went for information. They wanted to know what's this about, right? Black Panther, a comic book, what? Who is that? Who's that guy? But why? I won't say why. How did that movie end up being the third largest movie in terms of box office receipts ever? Why did Black Panther captivate the imagination of not only black people in America, but also internationally across the world? How is it that this symbol of what potentially Africa could have become gave people hope in a comic book hero, made them see that there is possibility in us being kings and queens and not being disconnected from the world, but being connected to the world and using what we have in terms of our wealth to help the world, but do it in a different way than we did with the transatlantic slave process. You see, Africa pre-colonial was made up of a lot of different states, a lot of different countries, a lot of different peoples that were involved in this process. North America pre-colonial was filled with Native Americans. Do you know who the Native Americans were in this part of the United States? What they were called? The Potawatomi Indians, Native Americans, yep. This was their home. So whenever I do circle in this part of the United States, I always give honor and respect to them, because it's them who did this work in this area, in this place. So I always recognize that it's that group, right? And then if I'm in Minnesota and I go to Ojibwa, I always give respect and honor to Ojibwa. If I'm in upstate New York, I always make sure I shout out the Mohawk. I always give them respect, the Erie. I always give them respect, because this is their land. This is where they placed in the ground this restorative justice work so that when we were ready, we could have it to dig it up and use it to help bring our children and our families into a positive place. So I always give honor and respect to our Native American brothers and sisters on this side. And so the Native Americans have a medicine wheel. And they've used that medicine wheel to beat addiction, to beat all type of illness and sicknesses on the reservation. And I felt like, hey, man, can I use your medicine wheel to help us deal with racism in America? And they said, sure. Well, they didn't say sure, but if I had a conversation, I'm sure they would say sure, right? I'm sure they'd say, all right, go ahead. Don't forget, give us respect, right? Make sure you quote us. That's ours. And so what I did was that I kind of overlapped the medicine wheel, which looks at the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects that we all bring into this space. So when you see me, you don't just see the physical, but you also hear my mental, right? You also know that there's emotion, right? You also know that there's a spirit, because I just did a session earlier, and I'm tired, so I'm pulling on that spirit. I'm pulling on aura right now. I'm like, aura, I'm pulling on you. I need your strength, because I'm a little tired. But I'm not weary, because I know we're doing good work today. And so I decided to take the medicine wheel and use it and apply it to the construct, that our tangible will flow into our physical arena, our mental will flow into the institutions that we begin to build, that the emotions will flow into our symbolic, because emotions have the symbols and connect with our emotions. They make us feel a particular way, whether negative or positive. And then finally, our truth and healing is going to be in the spirit, because that's where the truth is, and that's where the truth needs to be. I also realized that the Native Americans also created this wheel. This comes from a book called Peacemaking Circles from Crime to Community. Both come out of that book, written by Kay Pranis et al. So I want to give respect to Kay Pranis and her team and the other authors. But I also felt like in our relationship, our new relationship, remember Aspirational Justice is looking at a revision of a new relationship that America will have with the European Americans that are here, that we'd have a different relationship, that I felt like the whole notion of getting acquainted, building trust, building consensus around decision-making, and then finally community building, that the construct can overlap as well. Our getting acquainted would be our truth and healing, right? For me to get to know you and you to get to know me, I have to know your history, you have to know my history. And some of it we know, but some of it we don't know. And so that'll be an opportunity for us to talk. And circles can be used, and other restorative measures can be used to do that. In terms of our symbolic, that'll be our building trust, because now we have to build new symbols that we all can be proud of. We all can be proud of. Because when you look at this symbol, what you're looking at is the Georgia state flag. Do you know that flag is still flying over the Georgia state capitol right now? And what do we see on that flag is the Confederate flag, and from my estimation, the Confederate Army lost. So why is that symbol still above the Georgia state flag? The Georgia Capitol. Why are we still dealing with the vestiges of the Civil War? Because they're still affecting us right now, today. I'm gonna go back real quick because I hit that button by accident too fast, and then I'll move on to the next one, because I wanted to talk about the other side of the circle. Our institutional is our decision-making process, and then finally our tangible, which would be our community building area. And we build this new community brick by brick, and we do it together. Because we have to get rid of these old vestiges. Do you know what that is? Who that statue is right there? I'm glad you asked. That's General Robert E. Lee, the general over the Union Army, over the Confederate Army. And do you know where that statue is right now? It's in Charlottesville, Virginia. Do you know what happened in Charlottesville not too long ago? There was a rally and a march where a young lady was killed because we are still fighting the Civil War. There are still two Americas, and we have not figured out how to reconcile the two. We have a left wing and a right wing, but both wings are broken because they're not able to fly. They're too busy fighting each other. And African Americans are stuck in the middle. In New Orleans, they decided to take down the statue of General Robert E. Lee and many other statues. But of course, there's huge resistance because we still are fighting the Civil War. We are still living in that era, even though it's been done since 1865. Just like they're trying to reunify North Korea and South Korea, America needs a reunification. And I believe aspirational justice is that construct to reunify us into a new nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We need to build new institutions. That's the Smithsonian Institution for African American History in Washington, D.C. But we need more institutions that will be able to meet the needs of both the families, schools, and the faith base. We know right now that there's this thing called the school-to-prison pipeline. And the institution of schools are under attack by the criminal justice system because there's this need for bodies in the prison industrial complex. And that's because there's money behind this. Ava DuVernay did an incredible movie called The 13th. And if you watch that on Netflix, you'll see that this is all about not black, not white, but green. Just like the transatlantic slave trade was about money and economics. But it took men and women of courage to say morally that's wrong. And it's going to take us to say morally, if you look at those babies, your pathway is not into prison. Your pathway is into citizenship in schools. No matter what color you are, we're not locking you up. We need you out here to take care of us and take care of this nation. When you look at this flow chart of incarceration versus education, I want you to look at the bottom piece. We are the #1 highest population of prisoners in the world. And we are number 65 in actually building institutions of education. Hence why we need to build institutions of education and not institutions of incarceration, because it's not helping our communities, especially those that have been harmed by it. So I propose that the American government create a Bureau for African American Affairs, which will be within the Department of the Interior. Why do I say the Department of the Interior? Because there is a Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Department of the Interior. And do you know what their mission statement is? I'm glad you asked. To enhance the quality of life, to promote economic opportunity, and to carry out the responsibility to protect and improve the trust assets of American Indians, Indian tribes, and Alaskan natives. We need a Bureau of African American Affairs because our issues are unique to every human being that's on this side of the earth. We need some entity in the government that's at the table talking about our needs and talking about it in a way that our needs can and will be met. We can't just have civil rights organizations come when there's a particular type of president, because the Bureau of Indian Affairs is in the cabinet position of the Secretary of the Interior. So no matter what president it is, there's always going to be what? A Secretary of the Interior, right? And so it shouldn't be determined based upon what president or what wing we're in to have this bureau. It should always be in the purview of the American government. And it can be attainable with your help. Areas of concentration. I know this is small, so I'm going to read it real quick. First off, there needs to be a formal apology by the President of the United States, an apology and an acknowledgement, just like Trudeau did in Canada. There needs to be an apology and acknowledgement of what the Ma'afa has done and what slavery has done. And that has to come from the President of the United States. There needs to be economic equity, which we'll talk about in our third area in a minute. There needs to be educational entrepreneurship training that's a part of this. There needs to be criminal justice reform as a part of their mission statement for the Bureau for African American Affairs. Reforming policing, i.e. restorative policing strategies, and bridging the divide and community policing needs to be a part of this agency. Dismantling of institutional and structural racism in America. We want to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, but we're not talking about dismantling structural and institutional racism. And there's no way we can be successful in dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline if we are not focusing on dismantling structural and institutional racism, because the school-to-prison pipeline is based in structural and institutional racism. Mental and social emotional supports, i.e. post-traumatic slave syndrome. Dr. DeGroote did some incredible research on this piece, and we need to have that as a part of our conversation within this bureau. I'm talking about institution building, right? This is all theoretic. It didn't happen. Not yet. It didn't happen yet. And then finally, mentoring for African American males, which we'll touch on as we close. Now we're at the coup de grace. Symbolic, great. Creating new symbols, awesome. Creating institutions like the Bureau for African American Affairs, excellent. But we need you to show us the money. We need African Americans to have an opportunity to be connected to this economic prosperity that America has been able to benefit from our labor. 1619 to 1865 makes 246 years of free labor. You want me to show you how that's affected our wealth building as African Americans? I'm glad you asked. It will take black families 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth white families have today. And why do we think that's happened? That's because of slavery and institutional and structural racism. 265,000 is the mean net worth of a white American, whereas for an African American, it's $28,000. So not only are we held in bondage, but we also held in bondage financially as well. Where's our economic path to success? And I know all of us have heard that whole notion of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And we give us some boots and some straps, and you know we'll pull them up like the best of them. But what has happened is that we haven't been given the boots or the straps, and then have been penalized because we didn't have boots or straps. That rearrangement has to occur and has to change. Field Order 15, done by William Tecumseh Sherman, looked at the fact that there was an economic inequality going on as he marched to the sea and turned the war toward the Union side. And so he had a meeting with some pastors, and he asked them point blank, what do y'all need? And the pastor that was given freedom to talk shared that we need respect for our labor, and we need land. And so he looked around, and he saw all this land, all these plantations with nobody living on them. He said, all right, 40-acre lots every African American gets, and he saw some mules around, and he said, give them some mules so they can work the land. Hence, special order, Field Order 15 is where we get the whole notion of 40 acres and a mule. And it started working out real good until the new president, who took over after Abraham Lincoln, revoked the order. And then sharecropping came into play. And all of the different things that have been able to hold back African Americans from building wealth in America. From 1865 to 1968 is 103 years. That's 103 years of toil and suffering that African Americans had to go through economically in order to reach the place of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, April 4th, 1968. And 1968 to 2018 is 50 years. Do you know we're living in the year of Jubilee? We're in 50 years. We've arrived to 50 years. This is a great time, or at least it should be, in our lives. Because as the Bible says, in the year of Jubilee, everybody's free. All debts are clear. everybody has a right direction, a right path to be able to reset their lives. But for many poor families, this is not a year of Jubilee. In African American families, as you can see, black families with children living in poverty, 70% of them are headed by single women. There's an argument about that because the government is taking care of those children via SNAP and TANF and other programs, that if you marry that man and he brings an income, then those actual supports are going to go away. And so we have this whole notion of marriage is not being seen as a pathway to wealth or a pathway to economic stability, but we know that it is, and we know that it can be. And when we look at that 78%, the whole question is, how do we help that 78% move out of poverty and move into the middle class? Because the war on poverty that Lyndon Johnson put in place did a good job of taking away all of the depravity of poverty, all of the material lack, but it didn't do a good job of creating a stair step on how to move from being poor to being middle class, to being upper middle class, and being rich. But this is the thing that blows me away. Do you know that African Americans have at their fingertips $1.2 trillion of money to be able to use that money for a variety of different things that they need, mostly, consumer goods? That $1 trillion, that could turn around a lot of lives, couldn't it? But the problem is that the money is not being driven in the right way. Because when African Americans spend in their community, that dollar only flips one time. Whereas you go to other communities, that dollar flips maybe 6, maybe 7 times, meaning it stays in the community and it constantly recycled to keep building that community moving forward. And we know that's the truth because we have a lot of individuals that are in our communities that don't see the worth in our community, so they don't keep money in the community. They take the money from us, but they take it out of their community and they use it. And that's their choice. That's their choice. So the question is, what are the new things that we need to create to make sure that we're able to sustain us financially? This was from an article, New York Times, March 18, 2018. The title of the article is "Extensive Data Shows Punishing Reach of Racism for Black Boys." And basically, this slide basically shows that when an African-American rich child starts out in his life, that he has more of a chance to become poor than a white child that starts out in his life. And so that's pretty telling, that you started out rich. You started out with means. What happened to stop you from being able to pass that wealth on to your children? What happened to stop you from being able to realize the American dream financially, but then more importantly, to be able to sustain that for generations to come? Also, what was interesting in that article was this whole notion of children living in poverty and where are the dads? In white households, white kids, 63% of the dads are there, and only 4% for the black kids. The share of children living in high poverty neighborhoods with few dads, white kids only 1%, so if they live in Appalachia or any of the other places, only 1% without a father. But 66% of African Americans don't have that father. Very telling. Because when I look at technology now, it makes me a little scared. Because what it makes me realize is that that is what's going to be taking our jobs. Machines and robots. And who is teaching our children how to repair those? How are our children going to be able to connect into the economic realities, the new economic realities of if their education system is not teaching them the right things? This is what's going to happen to all of us if we don't figure out how to use technology to help us instead of technology being used to only help select people. And I feel that aspirational justice on the tangible end is not just about reparations, and a lot of people here talk about that. Reparations, we need reparations. You have a lot of groups that talk about reparations. But the reparations should not just be financial reparations. We need to look at these areas of the symbolic, the institutional, and the tangible in order to ensure that when reparations do occur, they're sustainable and they don't just last for a generation and they go away. what I've put forth, or what I hope, is that there we can create a guaranteed annual income for African Americans that will flow out of the Bureau for African American Affairs. What this guaranteed annual income would do is it would eradicate poverty. It would give monies that would be above the federal poverty level, and its focus would be to not only give reparations, but to also give these individuals an opportunity to guide their own lives and not worry about the government having to give them in-kind contribution, but give them financial contribution that they can use to better themselves and to be able to build wealth. I felt that this GAI would focus solely on how we as African Americans can begin to be repaired financially for the 246 years of chattel slavery. And that this wouldn't just be a handout, but this is a hand up. This is what is owed to us. And all we're going to do, guess what we're going to do with that money? We're going to take that money and we're going to use that money, because we're not just going to get the money, we're going to also get education with that money so we can know how to get stocks and mutual funds and not just buy beer and alcohol. That's your right to do that, but you can also use it to actually build your wealth for your family so that money can then do what it's supposed to do, and that is work for you. And so I believe that this GAI won't just be giving money to African Americans and just say, okay, just leave you to it, but it will be with stipulations specific to how African Americans can use that as a way to build wealth and to erase the 246 years of free labor that we gave to America. A way to repair the harm that we profess as restorative justice practitioners, right? We always talk about repairing the harm. Well, this is a way that we can repair the harm financially. I close today, not with my words, but with words of Dr. Martin Luther King. 11 months before he was killed, he did an interview with NBC. And he talked about where he wanted America to be. What I decided to do is just take 3 minutes of that and give you an understanding of how this is in line with what Dr. King thought and others thought back in 1967.
Is about the Negro. I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion. And this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps. But it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
I want to thank you all for being a part of this inauguration of Aspirational Justice. The family at Restorative Strategies, LLC is grateful to the committee for allowing me to come and to share something that I've been working on as a construct to deal with what's going on in our society right now. I'm about building bridges and not walls. And so my hope is that we can continue to build bridges into our new future as American citizens. Thank you.